Salam and greetings of peace and safety. I hope everyone and their loved ones are well and safe during these trying times. Welcome to today's webinar, Free Khurram Pervez, a human rights defender extraordinaire, hosted by Justice for All. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Farhana Mutala, and I will be moderating what promises to be a most informative and enlightening forum. A little bit about myself and Justice for All first. I'm originally from South Africa and have been fortunate to work with Justice for All on some of the most compelling human rights work over the last 2 years. Justice for All is a nonprofit organization that is actively engaged in partnership building, interfaith dialogue, and advocacy for human rights, peace, and justice globally. We are an NGO with consultative status at the United Nations. We promote policies that protect religious freedom, address the root causes of mass displacement, and work to eliminate the plight of refugees and forced migrants. We address the trend of rising Islamophobia worldwide and its harmful effects on Muslim communities. India today is heading down a dangerous trajectory of ethno-fascism. Under Prime Minister Modi and the ruling BJP party, we have seen a spate of attacks against any form of criticism of the Indian government. Just to name a few examples, the offices and home of the director of the Center of Equity Studies, Harsh Mander, were raided. So were the Delhi Rights Commission offices, and Amnesty officers were forced out of India. The number of human rights defenders incarcerated has been growing exponentially. I'm going to name a few of them. Parveen Ahangar, who has been featured on BBC's top list of 100 inspiring women. Parvez Amros, a human rights lawyer. Shabir Shah, known as the Mandela of Kashmir. Sadiq Kapan, a journalist. Asiya Andrabi. Ashraf Sarai, who died in detention last year. Father Stan Swami, the 84-year-old Jesuit priest, who passed away in custody last year. We pay tribute to these courageous defenders of human rights. Just last week, the Press Club, which is the hub of journalists in Kashmir, was shut down, the aim being to silence any documentation of Kashmiris' day-to-day lives and their oppression. One of Justice for All's campaigns, the Prisoners of Haq campaign, maintains a database of prisoners of conscience. We highlight their cases, advocate for them, record their and their families' testimonies, and also submit their cases to domestic and international human rights bodies, such as the United States Commission on International Religious Freedoms, USCIRF, and United Nations mechanisms. We submitted Khurram Pervez's case to USCIRF, which has now listed him as a victim of freedom of religion or belief. Justice for All has worked with Khurram and have distributed the 500-page report on torture of Kashmiris. Today, we continue our advocacy on behalf of Khurram Pervez by discussing his case in further depth. We welcome our esteemed guests, our panel of experts and human rights defenders who will be discussing Khurram's work, India's targeting of human rights defenders, and the chilling effect that Khurram's detention has on human rights activism in India and elsewhere. I'm going to begin by introducing Adam Shapiro. Adam serves as head of communications and visibility at Frontline Defenders. He is responsible for campaigning for human rights defenders around the world and working to increase the visibility of and respect for human rights defenders. Adam, would you kindly explain to us how Frontline Defenders went about advocating for Khurram? I know this is not the first time that Khurram has been detained for his activism, and Frontline Defenders, in fact, raised the alarm about his 2016 detention and played a large role in advocating for his release back then. Can you kindly tell us more about that? Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Sister Farhana, and to all the organizers of this event, this timely event, and this critically important event to raise awareness, not just about Khurram, as you indicated, but about the human rights situation in Kashmir, and I would even dare say more broadly in India as well, for minority communities, especially the Muslim community, but more just civil society in general. I think what we're seeing in Kashmir is in some ways maybe the tip of the spear of attacks against communities and against human rights in the country, led by the government and its supporters. As you indicated correctly, Frontline Defenders took up the case of Khurram Parvez back in his previous detentions and encounters with the authorities. It's what we do. Frontline Defenders is an international human rights organization working specifically for the protection and security of human rights defenders at risk, no matter what issues that they work on and no matter where in the world they work. And what we try to do is also, no matter what kind of risk or threat that they're facing, try to provide some kind of support, some kind of resources for them, for their security and protection. And some of that type of support can be through international advocacy and campaigning, which is where my role comes in as well. In Khurram's case, he's also well known to us because he's, in some ways, one of the key figures of the human rights movement in Kashmir, and a source of information for not just Frontline Defenders, I think, but for many international organizations for credible, reliable, and timely information about what's happening in Kashmir. And so we actually, as an organization, are in the process of conducting research with human rights defenders to understand the impact of the cessation of Kashmiri autonomy that the Indian government imposed now more than, well over a year ago now. And we were documenting how the effect of this was chilling civil society and stopping a lot of human rights work. And Khurram was in many ways a linchpin for us for that research, for connecting with different types of human rights defenders throughout the territory, not just the ones that are based in the main city or in the cities, but those who are working more remotely, those who are more sort of underground, those who are working on issues that don't normally get attention by the international community in Kashmir. And we were just on the same day that he was detained in November, preparing to conduct that day with him security assessment. He had put that off for himself for many weeks because that's just the type of person that he is. He's much more concerned and has often worked in such a way as to promote making sure that others are taken care of and others are secure and able to do their work ahead of himself. This is, I think, one of the wonderful qualities of Khurram, from what I've heard. I've not unfortunately had the opportunity to meet him myself. And so we weren't able to conduct that security assessment and guidance with him because of his detention. And unfortunately, what that has also meant is that our research efforts are hitting up against some difficulties, although we do have quite a bit of research already done, and we expect that report to be out in the coming month or so. But Khurram and how he works as a human rights defender in terms of the work he's done with the Jammu Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society, the JKCCS, and the Asian Federation Against Involuntary Disappearances, AFAD, with whom he also worked. The way that he goes about his work is to prioritize the victims themselves. It is to prioritize the interests and the concerns of and the well-being of the people, the community around him that he is trying to defend. And in that way, he really is not just a pillar of civil society in Kashmir, but really a great example of the kind of work and the kind of approach that human rights defenders take. And so what's important to note about that is that the kind of charges that he's facing at this point, and I'm sure I think other panelists will get more detail into this, the use of counterterrorism charges, the allegations being made against him, are so absurd and so beyond any serious consideration in normal circumstances that it would almost be laughable. But in this case, of course, it's anything but laughable. It's quite serious in the way that the state is seeking to deploy its top weapons of its arsenal, basically, to shut down Khurram, but more importantly, and this is what we keep hearing from other human rights defenders in Kashmir, is that the attack against him is really an attack against the entire civil society in Kashmir. And we often, a lot of times in the international human rights community, talk about that, about how an attack against one human rights defender is meant to not just shut that individual down, but meant to be a signal to the rest of human rights defenders, a warning or a form of intimidation against others. And that is another type of attack against human rights defenders. It's not just the individual who comes directly under attack, but what the consequences of that are for others. And it probably, from what all my colleagues have been telling me, from what all human rights defenders are telling us in Kashmir, is that this is an example, with almost without comparison, in that he was so central to civil society work, and not in a controlling way, but in a way that enabled access and enabled others to do their work effectively, and to do it within a context and within a means of having their voices amplified and having their perspectives included, etc. Targeting him in this way really does mean targeting the entire civil society in Kashmir, and has served to intimidate many into sort of quieting down their connections, their communications, whatever they can do with other human rights organizations, with each other, for fear. People are afraid that if they talk to each other, that itself could become criminalized. And so this case really does require and need the utmost attention by the international community, as well as, importantly, I think, by civil society in India itself, to really push back on the state, to challenge the charges that are being used against him, and to challenge the entire way that civil society is being treated in Kashmir today. Thank you.
Kerry Kennedy. She is president of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Organization. She has devoted more than 40 years to the pursuit of equal justice, the promotion and protection of basic rights, and the preservation of the rule of law. She works on a range of issues, including child labor, women's rights, disappearances, indigenous land rights, judicial independence, freedom of expression, ethnic violence, criminal justice reform, immigration, impunity, and environmental justice. Welcome, Kerry. Kerry, I understand that you have worked alongside Khurram, not just as a fellow colleague in the human rights struggle, but also as a friend. Can you tell us more about your experiences with Khurram, and perhaps offer us some insight into who Khurram is as a person that we might not be able to glean from his very impressive biography?
I'd love to talk about Khurram and what an extraordinary person he is, just as a friend. But I'd like to start, if you would indulge me, by speaking a little bit about my personal relationship, not only with Khurram, but with India itself. This all started in 1951 when then Senator John F. Kennedy visited India, where he met Prime Minister Nehru. He respected the Prime Minister as one of the great political leaders of the 20th century, and was deeply moved by the commitment of the Indian people to shuffle off the coils of colonial rule. He immediately went to work increasing US aid to India. And 9 years later, during President Kennedy's first inaugural address, he cited Nehru's soaring idealism. Uncle Jack was enamored with India and deeply concerned by Chinese aggression. At the outbreak of the Sino-India conflict, Jack sent the USS Eisenhower to the Bay of Bengal as a show of support to India. Uncle Jack sent billions of dollars in food and financial aid, underwriting ITT Kanpur, the Nagarjuna Sagar Dam, and the premier auto factory in Mumbai, among many other transformative projects. Under the Kennedy administration, India became one of the largest recipients of US aid in the world. And along with that aid, Jack sent his most impressive asset, Aunt Jackie, who also fought for that magical land. After Uncle Jack died, knowing how much he loved the country, Aunt Jackie looked to India for a model of contemporary architecture when she went to get a designer for the John F. Kennedy Center for Performing Arts in Washington, D.C., which is a virtual replica of a building in Delhi. Jackie shared her experiences with my cousin John, who visited India when we were at Brown University together, and he in turn shared them with me. So I was thrilled when I finally fulfilled a lifelong dream to go to India in 1984. And I spent much of that summer in Kashmir. I went also to Calcutta and Mumbai and Delhi, from big cities to tiny villages, visiting the homes of master craftsmen who are creating designs for an exhibit at the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York. The highlight of my trip was that time in Kashmir, hiking snow-capped Himalayas and spending evenings on houseboat in Lake Dal and speaking to human rights defenders. My connection with India has continued over the years, and it has been an important part of the work of the organization I lead, Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. This organization was founded by my father's family and friends in 1968 to carry forward his unfinished work on social justice. We protect civic space by defending fundamental freedoms to express dissent, hold leaders accountable, and speak truth to power on behalf of journalists, opposition groups, and human rights defenders. We presented the 1996 RFK Human Rights Award to Kailash Satyarthi for his courageous work emancipating children from slavery and his success passing legislation to end systemic child servitude. And 4 years later, we presented the RFK Award to Martin Makwan for his work on Dalit rights. So I was thrilled to be a judge for the Reebok Human Rights Award when it presented to the award to the courageous advocate and my good dear friend, Karum Parvez, in 2006. 2 years earlier, while Karum monitored parliamentary elections in Lawler, detractors planted a car bomb in his vehicle. They killed the driver, and they killed Karum's human rights colleague. Karum's leg was amputated, and he nearly lost his life. But rather than deterring him, the horror of that trauma led Karum to redoubling his efforts to monitor human rights abuses in Kashmir and hold the government accountable. Again and again, he has been harassed, followed, spied upon, threatened with death, unlawfully arrested, faced false criminal charges, and more. As a founding member of the Jammu Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society, Karum has documented abuses, provided legal aid, and advocated against human rights violations in the region. His groundbreaking work to uncover the presence of 2,300 unmarked single or mass graves in the region in 2009 shocked the world. In the wake of his cutting-edge documentation, instead of holding him up as the hero he is and putting statues of him everywhere and naming schools after him, instead, the attacks and harassment against him redoubled. In September 2016, Karum was prevented from boarding a flight to Geneva to attend the Human Rights Council, where he was scheduled to submit a report on human rights violations in Kashmir and attend a European Union session in Brussels. The next day, he was arrested on trumped-up charges at his home and detained for 76 days. He was only released when the Jammu and Kashmir High Court quashed his detention, calling the arrest illegal and arbitrary. And then in October 2020, the National Investigation Agency searched Karum's house along with the houses of several other human rights defenders, as part of a crackdown on NGOs who expose abuse in an attempt to silence critics. Kurum has always worked at grave peril. Most recently, on November 22nd, 2021, the National Investigation Agency and police raided and searched Kurum's home and JKCCS offices in Srinagar for 14 hours. They confiscated his phone and his laptop, and then they detained Kurum for what they claimed was routine questioning. His family was later told that he had been arrested. He was charged under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, a capricious anti-terrorism law that has been criticized across the globe and makes being freed on bail extremely difficult. He has been detained ever since, and if convicted, he could face up to 14 years in prison or even the death penalty, all on trumped-up charges. I've known Kurum for 16 years. He's a good friend. He's stayed with our family at our home at the Kennedy compound in Massachusetts. He's vacationed with my family in Kashmir. My daughters and I will never, ever forget one day that we spent with Kurum, floating across Lake Dal on a gondola, surrounded by the soaring Himalayas, watching an eagle hunt, and then exploring the world-renowned Shalimar Gardens, one of the most stunning places on earth. Kurum spoke at length about his love for that ancient land, its history, and its people, his commitment to peace, his fierce love of justice, his commitment to nonviolence, his love of his family, his love of his people. I'm here today because Kurum is a dear friend of mine and the entire Kennedy family. But I'm also here today, not only about a man who I hold in highest esteem. I'm here today because Kurum's most recent arrest is a prime example of the crackdown on civic space in India and across the globe, where regimes target journalists, lawyers, and human rights defenders who play the critical role of holding governments accountable for abuse. For this courageous work in defense of democracy, transparency in the management of public affairs, and upholding the very rights the governments are responsible for protecting under their own laws and under international obligations. These heroes and patriots are threatened, brutalized, tortured, disappeared, and murdered by their own governments. More and more anti-terrorism laws are being used to target legitimate critics of regime abuse and stifle dissent. Instead of prosecuting those who document and expose human rights violations, the Indian government should welcome these findings and hold the violators, particularly those in the security forces, accountable. Human rights work must not be criminalized. India must amend the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and assure accountability for abuses. My dad, Robert Kennedy, said the sharpest criticism often goes hand in hand with the deepest idealism and love of country. No one personifies my father's words more clearly than Kurum Parvez. He must be released immediately. He should be recognized not as a criminal, but as the hero and patriot that he is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kerry. That was so touching. I'm now going to turn to Professor Athar Zia. She's a political anthropologist, poet, short fiction writer, and columnist. She's an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and Gender Studies program at the University of Northern Colorado, Greeley. She is the founder, editor of Kashmir Lit, author Resisting Disappearance. Professor Zia, you have written extensively on Khurram's case. Can you tell us a little bit more about his case, enlighten the audience, give us more in-depth information into his case? We'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and congregating and arguing and pleading against Khurram's detention, which is arbitrary, the charges are quite vague, and we've already established that the esteemed panelists have already established what's happened thus far, especially when we think about how India is cracking down on the Kashmiri civil society and, of course, its own civil society. Khurram's case right now is technically languishing, which is what happens to the cases of myriads and countless Kashmiris in the Indian jails. Yesterday, his judicial custody was extended. And this is going to happen because this is some sort of a revolving door policy that India already has applied in cases of many political prisoners. But with the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, the law under which Khurram has been arrested, the arrest memo suggests that he has waged war against India. And of course, in talking about terror funding and all of that, what they are actually doing is they're going to be able to extend his custody up till 180 days, which is what they are seeking, without filing a charge sheet. So at this moment, Khurram's lawyers don't know what exactly the charges are, except for the arrest memo, which suggests the things that I said before. So the way we look at Khurram's case in this present moment is the way Kashmiris and political prisoners inside Kashmir, also the human rights defenders inside Kashmir have been treated. So Khurram becomes very symbolic in that sense, that the case is going to continue to languish and there's going to be no accountability. And that's what the lawyers are at this present moment. There's a lot of vagueness around what exactly he has been arrested for. The charges are completely trumped up, and that's everyone who knows Khurram and everyone who knows Khurram's work and also knows how Kashmiris are treated. In that sense, we are dealing with a lot of arbitrariness, we are dealing with a lot of vagueness, we are dealing with a lot of vengeance that the state is wreaking upon Khurram and his organization as well. So that's kind of where the case is at the moment. Initially, he was with the NIA, which is the National Investigative Agency, which has been weaponized very much against Kashmiris inside Kashmir. He was in their custody for 12 days, after which he went into judicial custody. And that's where this is kind of being repeated. The cycle is being repeated, and they're kind of extending his incarceration. And because they have the UAPA, which is this unlawful law, basically, a law that has been accounted as a lawless law. And I just saw a couple of comments in the chat where they're actually talking about people who are being slapped with this law, and at the same time, they don't know what's going to happen with their case. And many Kashmiris, and Khurram is prominent, Khurram is very well known, Khurram's work is known world over, he's a person of global repute. In his case, you can kind of see what happens to ordinary Kashmiris as well. So he would tell you himself, if he were here after 2016 when he was released, I think one of the first things he kind of began talking about was how many people inside these jails, especially Kashmiris, are languishing without any kind of judicial, they don't have lawyers, they don't have people to represent them. So that's kind of where the case is at this moment.
I'm now turning over to Carolyn Nash of Amnesty USA. Carolyn Nash is the Asia Advocacy Director for Amnesty International USA. Prior to joining Amnesty, Carolyn lived for 6 years in Myanmar, where she managed human rights and governance programs for Traquair and authored Youth Waging Peace, a guide to youth-led prevention of violent extremism published by UNESCO. Carolyn, if you could tell us, Amnesty has been a vocal critic of UAPA. Can you tell us more about how UAPA is used against human rights critics. We know that Amnesty's offices were also forced out of India. If you could throw some light onto that, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. And let me start by thanking Justice for All for convening this and for inviting me to speak along these co-panelists who are extraordinary human rights advocates. It's a pleasure to be here and to be a part of this call. It's also important to have this space to speak candidly about what's happening right now in Kashmir and more broadly in India. I'm happy to get into a bit of what's happening or what happened in the past with Amnesty, perhaps to give a small snapshot of that. In September 2020, Amnesty's bank accounts were frozen, and this had a domino effect of making it impossible for us to continue our work here. I think it's important to look at the fact that there have been other ways that the Indian government has looked to shut down human rights work, human rights research, investigation, including denials of FCRAs, which is different than what happened to us, but shows a trend of looking to make sure that these stories of injustice are not coming out in the ways that they need to come out. And so part of where I want to start this conversation is around a core part of this event that we're a part of right now, which is the belief that telling these stories can lead to action, that exposing injustice is part of the work that we need to do to remedy that injustice. And to that end, I'd like to frame this somewhat in recognition that other actors, including the US government, have a role to play in how this particular story unfolds. And that means by pressing the Indian governments to release Parvez, and more broadly, pressing the authorities to repeal some of the laws, in particular, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Acts, which I'll speak about in a bit more detail, that have been used repeatedly against Parvez and against other human rights defenders. So essentially what we're doing here today is what Parvez has made his life's work, which is to tell the story of someone who has been a target of unjust laws, a target of intimidation by authorities, a target of a government's effort to silence dissent. Throughout his career, he has documented enforced disappearances, he's investigated unmarked graves in Kashmir, he has brought international attention to countless rights violations perpetrated by government forces. In 2018, which was the deadliest year in a decade in terms of civilian casualties, his team documented 160 civilian deaths in Kashmir, while the Indian authorities acknowledged only 37. In the following year, amid a worsening environment for human rights defenders, he continued to track countless examples of Indian security forces employing excessive force, especially firing pellets and tear gas shells, abuses that resulted in at least 6 deaths. In short, the work that we're talking about here is the work of making visible people the government tries to silence or erase. And because of that work, the Indian authorities have made repeated efforts over the years to silence him and to erase the work that he has been doing. They've employed different tactics to do this. As was mentioned earlier, in 2016, authorities prevented him from traveling to a Human Rights Council session in Geneva. He's been arrested before this using the Public Safety Act, which was widely used by authorities to detain people without sufficient evidence for a trial or conviction. And today, as you mentioned, we're seeing the Indian government use the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, the UAPA, which has really become a cornerstone of the Indian authorities' ongoing and worsening campaign of oppression. His most recent arrest was part of a broader crackdown on civil society and human rights defenders that extends across India, but was seen especially in Kashmir. And during this time, the UAPA has been widely abused to stoke fear, to detain activists and journalists and political opponents. The legislation is problematic for a number of reasons, but there are 2 that I'd like to focus on briefly. The first is that it violates the individual's right to a fair trial. And the second is that it has a broad chilling effect on free expression and the ability to engage in public dissent. It compromises the right to free trial in a few ways. It imposes extremely stringent bail requirements and intentionally slows down the investigative processes. Essentially, this allows for the long detention of people without any sort of due process. It allows the government to hold individuals for 180 days before bringing formal charges. And it was amended in 2019 to give greater leverage to authorities to designate individuals terrorists without a trial, without proper evidence. This definition of terrorism is overly broad, and that allows the government to use the law to label and detain just about anyone that they want to target. This is particularly evidenced in Parvez's case, where speaking out on government abuses has been construed as a criminal conspiracy and an attempt to wage war against the government. On the second point, This sweeping definition of terrorism is very intentional. The weaponizing of the UAPA against rights defenders and journalists and others is the point of the legislation. It's designed to create a culture of fear. When prominent rights activists and others are targeted, the people around them learn that they have to self-censor for their own safety. And it's this pervasive climate of fear that chokes out free expression, that dims the light that activists and journalists and others have worked so hard to shine on human rights violators. Ultimately, vibrant civil societies are extinguished quickly because not every individual has to be targeted for that work to be successful. All that's necessary is to dismantle the environment that makes it possible to speak out. And that's unfortunately what we're seeing the Indian government doing today. The UAPA is not the only tactic that is employed to this end. The government has also ramped up its surveillance, its suppression of media sources, and its shutdown of access to information across the country, most severely in Kashmir. In 2020, the Indian government shut down the internet more times than any other country. The majority of internet shutdowns occur in Kashmir, where in addition to at least 109 shutdowns, the Indian authorities also took additional measures to target VPNs, which are commonly used to circumvent information blockages. So from the Public Safety Act to the UAPA to these internet shutdowns, we are watching in real time as the Indian government refines and escalates their efforts to silence activists, to stop people like Parvez from exposing government abuses, and importantly, to end the research and the investigative work that is the absolute foundation of any human rights organization, certainly including Amnesty. Parvez has been repeatedly targeted by government authorities for years because he tells these stories of injustice in a way that inspires outrage and inspires action. And today we are here to tell his story in a fashion that we hope will do the same. The US government, for one, has made several overtures to the Indian government recently, including their welcome at the Democracy Summit. The Biden administration needs to apply human rights standards consistently, whether speaking to allies or adversaries. In this case, that means making public demands for Parvez's release, pushing the Indian government to repeal the UAPA, and making that push not only in the context of the US-India relationship, but also in partnership with other like-minded governments. Most importantly, this administration has to show solidarity with civil society and human rights defenders whose work is the bedrock of building a more just world. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you very much to everyone who is here today, both to speak and to listen.
Thank you so much for that. Next, we turn to Nilda Leman-Sevilla, Secretary General of Asian Federation Against Involuntary Disappearances, AFAD, and co-chairperson of Families of Victims of Involuntary Disappearances, FIND. Can you kindly, Nilda, tell us, we have spoken a lot about the larger political context of enforced disappearances and arbitrary detention. I was wondering if you could speak more about the personal harms on these human rights abuses. Could you tell us more about how Khurram's detention likely impacts his family and immediate community?
Hey, thank you, Farhana. I am no longer the Secretary General of AFAD. We just had our Congress last month, and I have also resigned from my post as co-chairperson of the Families of Victims of Involuntary Disappearance. But I am still very active in the organization because, our family has this personal crusade against enforced disappearance because my elder brother, a labor and human rights lawyer, is a desaparecido. Khurram Parvez, newly re-elected for a third term as chairperson of the Asian Federation Against Involuntary Disappearances, or AFAD, is neither a victim of enforced disappearance who has reappeared, nor a relative of a disappeared person. But after engaging with the families of the disappeared and listening to the travails of the mothers, wives, and children, his heart and mind were open to the egregiousness of enforced disappearance and its continuing dire impact on the families left behind. Hence, his prompt decision to join and eventually lead them in the painful search for their loved ones and the arduous struggle for truth and justice. He said, and I quote him, "I felt it is criminal to not be involved after hearing their stories," unquote. It was at the 5th AFAD Congress held in Manila in 2014 that Kuram was first elected chairperson. I was then a member of the panel that oversaw the election and didn't have the faintest idea that I would be working closely some years later with a young chairperson. Much less did I anticipate how impressed I would ultimately be by his brand of leadership as a human rights defender, or HRD. It is said that there are 3 C's that define a leader. 1, competence, 2, commitment, and 3, character. Kuram unequivocally demonstrates all this and more. I'd like to add a 4th, which is courage, 5th, charisma, and 6th, consistency. The first C, competence, is best tested in making decisions. As an HRD leader, Kuram is a consummate decision maker, enabled by relevant knowledge of myriad human rights issues and concerns, buttressed and honed by a wealth of experience. Kuram is acutely conscious of the interplay of national interests and geopolitical factors in international relations that impinges on the situation of human rights defenders. This is not only because he witnesses such interplay, but because he makes sure that no matter how busy he is, he sets aside time to read, analyze, and most importantly, share what he knows, actively engaging in knowledge exchange. Undoubtedly, he knows how decisions and actions of HRDs are jeopardized or compromised by realpolitik of states serving as enablers of repressive yet populist regimes. Kuram's arbitrary detention on the basis of the Draconian Unlawful Activities Prevention Act is a searing testimony to the abusive reprisals against HRDs who fight for institutional reforms and deliverance from state repression. In view of the failure of national governments to effectively resolve human rights issues and concerns, Kuram believes in the imperative of seeking international solidarity and support to address these issues. He urges HRDs, however, to strongly develop their advocacy capacities and forge strong partnerships among civil society organizations at the local, national, and in regional levels to prepare for and complement international work. In this regard, Kuram encourages AFAD member organizations to conduct researches for knowledge building, even as he encourages bilateral activities among the organizations to strengthen teamwork and unity. He also pitches that the families of the disappeared should be adequately and effectively capacitated to help them transform from victim survivors to human rights defenders and catalysts of change. In relating with the families of the disappeared, Kuram points out the importance of conducting memorialization activities that signify HRD's sincerity in recognizing the invaluable role the disappeared play in history, particularly in the struggle for freedom and democracy. In facing the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, Kuram is extra mindful of how the staff members of AFAD are managing the difficult situation. I was the AFAD Secretary General at the onset of the pandemic. He came up with the idea that the two of us engage individual staff members in separate conversations. Through these individualized conversations, we got to learn the nuances in each worker's response, not only to the pandemic challenges, but to other issues and concerns, personal or organizational, that affect their work in AFAD, particularly their relationship with the families of the disappeared. Needless to stress, Kuram is well aware that HRDs must not only be physically healthy, but be mentally and psychosocially fit to productively engage in human rights work and derive fulfillment from the endeavor. Khurram's empathy and sincere efforts to feel the pulse and understand the needs of those he works with and for serve as the foundation of his commitment to human rights, fundamental freedoms, justice, and democracy. Real commitment, the second C of leadership, is enduring and gets stronger with the passage of time. This largely explains why, after his 76-day detention in 2016, Khurram is now again in his 61st day of incarceration. He never turns his back on the causes he advocates and is committed to pursue them notwithstanding seemingly insurmountable hurdles, including risks to his security. Khurram's steadfast commitment is one indelible mark of his character, the third C. Also distinctly Khurram's is his deep insight into other person's character and motives. Those who know Khurram would attest that he is like a psychic or a surgeon in analyzing a person's personality, core values, and preferences. And his initial impressions are often validated by subsequent actions. Once he told me at the spur of the moment what he thought were somebody's plans and how they would be executed. I was later amazed at the accuracy of his prognosis. Incisive insight and judicious discernment are also hallmarks of Khurram's character. This could have helped him eschew threats to his rights and freedoms, as he was well aware of these threats. He could have sought a safe refuge or a sanctuary on account of the high risks he was and still is facing. But he chose to stay and fight peacefully and lawfully in Kashmir. This brings us to the fourth element of his leadership, courage. It is common knowledge that he lost a leg to a landmine blast that nearly cost him his life. In 2016, he was jailed in a far-flung facility for 76 days. In October 2020, his house and office were searched and electronic devices were seized by the Indian National Investigation Agency. He was under non-stop surveillance. Despite all these hazards, Khurram's courage never diminished. It even intensified. It is the fifth C, consistency, in competence, commitment, character, and particularly his courage, that has imbued Khurram with the sixth and last C, a certain charisma that can rival that of a football star or any celebrity for that matter. Being a charismatic HRD leader with a huge following, Khurram can definitely generate widespread support for the mission or advocacy he pursues. For instance, when AFAD spearheaded the End Enforced Disappearance online face mask campaign in August 2020 to mark the International Day of the Disappeared, Khurram led the wearing of face masks with the End Enforced Disappearance call, which attracted supporters, admirers, and shall I say, fans of Khurram in Kashmir to join the campaign. Verily, Khurram is a leader and a human rights defender extraordinary, earning him the international respect he so well deserves. Under his victim-centered servant leadership as chairperson, AFAD received the 2016 Asia Democracy and Human Rights Award from the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. The full trust of AFAD member organizations in Khurram is evidenced by his being re-elected for a third consecutive term as chairperson, because it is crystal clear to all of us that Khurram Parvez is not only an extraordinary human rights defender, he is an extraordinary human. His unjust detention, is not just a deprivation of his liberty, it is a deprivation of his service to humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nilya. Thank you for sharing about Khurram's wonderful personality traits and his impressive track record as far as human rights go. Finally, but not lastly, we will be we have with us Mary Lawler, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. Special Rapporteur Lawler has a long career in human rights work, including as the director of the Irish section of Amnesty International and founding Frontline Defenders, an organization that protects the needs of human rights defenders at risk around the world. In her current role as a special rapporteur, she investigates and reports on the situation of human rights defenders worldwide and recommends steps that countries and the international community can take to ensure the effective implementation of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. Welcome, Special Rapporteur Lawler. We'd like to know, what has the UN response been to the situation? What actions have been taken, and what can the global community do in addition to your other, whatever other comments you may have? Thank you.
Thank you all very much for having me here. I'm really pleased to be here, and I particularly love the way that you brought Khurram into the room with us. So thank you all. And I reiterate my call for his release and all the other detained human rights defenders in India. He is a man, as we all know, who has been a fearless advocate for human rights over so many years. In recent years, I have watched with dismay at the moves undertaken by the Indian authorities to criminalize the defense of human rights in the country. Since I took up the Human Rights Defenders mandate in May 2020, I have joined other special rapporteurs in writing 16 times to the Indian government regarding the targeting of dozens of human rights defenders. I am disturbed by the pattern that emerges in these communications, namely the abuse of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, as we've heard, and the conflation of human rights defenders' legitimate and peaceful work with terrorism. It is also striking that nearly 2/3 of the communications that I have sent to the Indian authorities involve human rights defenders from ethnic or other minority backgrounds. Unfortunately, the Indian authorities have only provided responses to 6 of those 16 communications. This is extremely disappointing from a state which was recently re-elected to the Human Rights Council and which prior to its election pledged to continue to engage constructively with the Council and its mechanisms. Indeed, I struggle to understand how a state which has been systematically harassing, arresting, and jailing human rights defenders over the past number of years can be judged to be upholding the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights as is required of Council members. The UN human rights machinery relies on individual human rights defenders and NGOs to send us information, to provide their analysis, and to present their views. The system cannot work if the only views that we hear from are those of states and UN member states. And indeed, Khurram was one of the first people who wrote to me after I took up the mandate. It is widely understood and has been agreed upon by member states in various resolutions of the General Assembly and Human Rights Council that the importance of civil society participation is necessary in protecting and promoting human rights. For years, Khurram's voice has been so important in raising awareness about appalling human rights violations in Jammu and Kashmir and seeking justice for those who otherwise would not be heard. The Indian authorities, as we've heard, tried to stop him from being heard in 2016 as he prepared to travel to Geneva to attend the Human Rights Council and to brief UN bodies and diplomats. At that time, Kurm was already well known to special procedures and to the Office of the High Commissioner for his submission of complaints of violations in Jammu and Kashmir and his organization's submission of a shadow report on India's UPR. It was clear at the time that the travel ban was an attempt to prevent him from further engaging with the UN. My predecessor wrote to the Indian authorities following the incident, and in its reply, the government accused Kurm of being involved in anti-India activities and working against the interests of Jammu and Kashmir. I fail to see how Kurm's upholding of international human rights standards can do anything but advance the interests of Jammu and Kashmir and those who live there. The government's response ended by stating that this is neither a case of forced disappearance or reprisal. The UN Secretary General thought otherwise and included Kurm's case in his reprisals report in 2017. Kurm was eventually freed, as we've heard, after being held for 76 days in detention. And I think it is a true testament to his character and his deep commitment to human rights that he was undeterred by this treatment. Between 2016 and 2018, he provided information to the first ever UN Human Rights Report on Kashmir, at a time when the UN Human Rights Office was not granted unconditional access, and so was reliant on human rights defenders and others to carry out remote monitoring. Following the publication of this report, in which his own case was also raised, he was subjected to an online smear campaign and death threats. He was again included in the Secretary General's 2019 report on reprisals, which stated that reprisals against him were continuing. In its pledges ahead of its re-election to the Human Rights Council in October last year, the Indian Permanent Mission to the UN in New York stated that, and I quote, "India will continue to foster the genuine participation and effective involvement of civil society, including human rights defenders, in the promotion and protection of human rights and strengthen protection against reprisals." 2 months later, the UN Human Rights Office challenged India to make good on this commitment in relation to Kurm, saying, "In view of this context of previous reprisal for legitimate conduct, we call on the Indian authorities to fully safeguard his right to freedom of expression, association, and personal liberty, and to take precautionary steps to releasing him." But of course, they did not. Of course, Kurm's case is only one of dozens of human rights defenders in India whose situation I'm extremely concerned about. And I have listened to so many human rights defenders since I took up the mandate from India explain their concerns to me. And indeed, last year I was appalled, as somebody mentioned earlier on, at the death in custody of 84-year-old Father Stan Swami. And it was just such a cruel case because not only was he old and in bad health, but they wouldn't even give him a sippy straw for his Parkinson's disease. And like so many other peaceful activists, he had been accused of having links with terrorism. It was a stain on India's human rights record, as I said, and I continue to firmly believe this. And I included Father Stan's death in my report last year to the Human Rights Council on the killing or death in detention of human rights defenders. In light of the above and the ongoing environment for human rights defenders, what can be done both in relation to Kurm's case and more generally? Firstly, the continued work of human rights defenders in Jammu and Kashmir is essential. reporting on violations, getting out the information whatever way possible, and continuing to hold the authorities to account. And for the other organizations, continuing to support that work is also vital. Secondly, I think that India having a seat both on the Security Council and the Human Rights Council this year presents an opportunity, perhaps counterintuitively, to exert pressure on its human rights record. It seems to be a coordinated effort on the part of the government to present a certain face to the world, but with that comes greater scrutiny. And I would like to think that there may be more venues for your struggles to be heard. And linked to that, may I say, I think trying to get as much sustained media attention as possible is key. I've come to increasingly believe that this is one of the few remaining effective advocacy tools in a world where states which say they prioritize human rights cannot be relied on to raise cases with allies. I have seen myself, when I tweet or issue press releases on human rights defenders, it almost always produces some kind of government response and can lead sometimes to a change in the situation. Finally, the issue of reprisals for interaction with the UN is always going to get attention within the UN system. It has been prioritized. A reprisals team has been established within the Office of the High Commissioner. And though little may change, it is difficult for states to avoid being criticized publicly in the Secretary General's reports now when reprisals occur, assuming, of course, that human rights defenders are willing to provide the information and are willing to be named. I think as long as consent is obtained, it is important to ensure that any cases involving reprisals are sent to the Office of the High Commissioner to make sure that this issue stays on the agenda. It may also be useful to look at what Human Rights Council members this year have highlighted in terms of reprisals and as in terms of what their priorities are, you know, whether reprisals for defenders who work in conjunction with the UN, if that's a priority for them on the council, and contact them then bilateral on this, because there are quite a number of states now that are talking about reprisals. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Special Rapporteur Lawler. We will now see, we'll now check if there are any questions from the audience. Somebody asked, I would like to know if there have been any attempts of getting the US government to engage and pressurize the Indian government to release Khurram. Carolyn, do you have any insight?
Yeah, I can step in. I can't provide a lot of insight into what the US-India conversations may or may not look like, but I do think it's important both to you know, a little bit to Mary's point that the media pressure can be incredibly important, but so can the pressure of constituents in making this a priority for the US government, not only directly through the State Department of the administration, but also individual Congress people and representatives. I think it's important to raise this and make it clear that this is something that people are watching. And I want to say that I think it needs to be beyond the US speaking to the Indian government. I feel like part of what the US needs to do, the administration needs to do, is work in concert with other like-minded governments in order to make it clear that this is not coming strictly from DC. This is something that is being watched around the world, and that we can operate, and that way we can operate from a place of coordination and greater strength in leveraging that. And then the one other thing I'll say, I saw some questions about why doesn't the US do more? I think that in addition to telling the stories of these of individual human rights defenders who are facing this, it is important to talk about how these laws are actually applied in such horrific ways. Because the idea of India, the Indian government, being a strategic economic and security partner to the US, that has to be based on an assumption that the laws are in place to do what they purport to do. So that terrorist laws, for example, would be used for that purpose and not for the purpose of stifling dissent. So I think in other in media contexts and in advocacy contexts, explaining the depth of misuse and abuse that these laws, when these laws are translated into how they actually play out and what they actually mean for civil society, is part of generating more forceful action, at least on the part of the US government.
Also, Justice for All has a tool to call Congress to pressure to pressure India, and we've posted that in the chat section. There's another question from a Kashmiri. As the ground is shrinking in the valley and Indian authorities are curbing the voices from the ground, be it human rights activists, journalists, or common people, they are coming for everyone. What should be the course of action for the international community and the role of the Kashmiri diaspora? Would anyone like to take this on? Professor Zia?
I could answer that a little bit.
Thank you.
So what we have seen thus far with Khurram, I think his case is the most symbolic at the moment of what's happening in Kashmir. If this could happen to Khurram, whose work is well established, people know him, what must be happening to people? Just last week, I think another human rights activist was also apprehended, and he's also in incarceration. And we've seen what has happened to Parveena Hangar, who is the co-founder of the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons. She was also under NIA investigation. So that ground is being suppressed at the moment and has always been suppressed. I think that's something that we have to deeply consider when we are thinking about Kashmir, that it's not something new. This is very much the criminalization of Kashmiri voice has been going on for the last 74 years. And now what's happening is it's being institutionalized in the most deepest ways possible. And of course, the rest of the crackdown with the rest of the Indian community and human rights defenders outside Kashmir, that's also happening. And what we realize that outside in the rest of the world, especially here in the West with Kashmiri diaspora, increasingly, like we think about the solidarities need to be made. And I think that call has already been established by everyone speaking here. What the diaspora has been doing since 2019, and Khurram has been part of those conversations with the diaspora and also inside Kashmir as to what the international community can do. And I think that's something that we are thinking about as part of the diaspora, as academics and activists. And I think we need to think more creatively. It's not only case by case basis. We don't have to just think about one thing, but this is a concatenation of a lot more things that's unfolding at this moment. And Khurram is kind of in this moment, as I said, he's very symbolic. Kashmir is a political dispute, and this is criminalization of Kashmiri voice, and that's what we see in Khurram. This is the criminalization of, well-established human rights defense work, and human rights violations are not happening in a vacuum. They're not happening without a political context. I mean, that's the most important question. Like, why is Khurram so active for the last 2 decades, and why is he doing what he's doing? And that kind of goes deeper into the question of the political dispute that remains unsolved till this point in time. And I think that's very important. And Kashmiri diaspora is thinking about that after 2019, when Kashmir's autonomy, the quasi-autonomy, for whatever purposes, a nominal form of autonomy was taken away. Most of the repression and the communication siege and blackout that happened in Kashmir for almost 2 years, it was in those moments that the diaspora was kind of mobilized in ways that it had not seen before. And the issue was re-internationalized because Kashmir issue is already an international issue. So there is a lot of thinking going on in diaspora, but at the same time, the solidarities it requires, because diaspora is not something in a vacuum. You know, they have people back home, and there is a lot of repression happening, and diaspora also is finding its limitations in that, as to how far it can go, and how far they are able to pay that price of being under repression back home, because they have people back home. So it's kind of these linkages that exist between diaspora and people on ground, and the repression and the maximization and the amplification of that reprisals that is happening is also becoming a limitation all across. So in that, we really need to think in a more creative manner. We cannot just be doing it in a manner that we are referring to case by case and kind of moving on, but we also have to hold India accountable with as regards to what the political dispute is as well, and kind of questioning that as to how in the last 72 years, this deep criminalization of Kashmiri society, as someone pointed out in the chat, it's not just one person. It's even an 8-year-old kid. It's even a 15-year-old kid, and people are being criminalized left, right, and center just for raising their voice. And I think it goes back to really addressing and finding ways to address the political dispute, and also, of course, the ramifications of what's happening, which is, of course, exemplified in Khurram's case and many other cases like that. So yeah, going back to thinking about Kashmiri diaspora and also other diasporas that is offering the solidarity to Kashmiris, I think we really are in a very creative and generative moment. I'm not hopeless in thinking about that, because we are able to have this conversation today all across the board with people who are giving the solidarity, unconditional solidarity to Khurram and his work. And that kind of tells us that the criminalization that has happened of Kashmiri voice is completely uncalled for. And we need to parse this question as to why are voices like Khurram's inside Kashmir today criminalized, and why is the Kashmiri dissent criminalized, so to speak. And I would also establish that Kashmiri dissent is very different from what is happening outside Kashmir in the rest of India. I know that when we talk about the anti-Muslim violence and reprisals against Muslim human rights defenders, I think Kashmiri situation is slightly different from what the larger picture is. It is a Muslim Islamophobic issue, but at the same time, Kashmiris have been doing what they have been doing for the last 74 years. And that's kind of the context behind the human rights violations inside Kashmir. And unless and until we don't recognize that, I don't see this problem going away, and we'll keep on having more and more Khurrams trying to do what they're doing, and they're being under reprisal as of now.
Thank you for that, Professor Zia. Many members of the audience are really concerned about what can be done to change what is going on. And so somebody mentions the Indian government's atrocities against ordinary citizens and human rights activist journalists have been going on for the last 70 years. All the efforts against those atrocities seem to be very ineffective. US government and other like-minded governments are not doing enough to neutralize these human rights violations. What can change that? Anyone like to have a go at that?
Can I just say something a little generally about mobilizing and building alliances of people that could perhaps help? So when you're talking about the diaspora, or when you're talking about NGOs, or I always think that change comes about as a collective effort. That you need everything. You need the human rights defenders. You need the NGOs supporting them. You need the diaspora. You need states and embassies and all of that. So one of the things I would suggest for the diaspora is, whatever country you find yourself in, that you sensitize the embassies in that country about the case of Khurram and about what's happening in India, and in particular in Jammu Kashmir, and see if you can build a network through the diaspora of people who are mobilizing on this kind of action, and also trying to find out, is there any chink of light where a state might be willing. Some states are usually willing to raise individual cases, as it won't change the structural nature without massive engagement and mobilization. But at least I do think that, you know, if people in whatever country they are, whatever embassies they are, they can contact and sensitize and raise the case and ask for that government to raise the case. That I find is a very it sometimes works, and also the EEAS, the European External Action Service embassies on the ground, because they all are supposed to have human rights defenders focal points, and they should be approached. So that's just, I just wanted to feed that in. And I can tell you that anytime, you know, I have had so many ambassadors contacting me if I do a press release, trying to stop it. So I do think that and I know that, for example, last year, there was, in some instances, there was a lot of publicity, which did lead to certain advances being made in different cases around the world. And thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Special Rapporteur Lawler. Hina?
Yes, I just wanted to let people know we've shared in the chat. If people want to get involved with his advocacy here in the United States, please fill out the volunteer form. If you're here in the United States, please do use the calling tool on Monday. Offices are closed today, to call Congress and your local Congress people and senators to take up this cause, ask for a meeting. There's many things that we can do here to advocate for him and bring up his case with our own leadership. And we will have the same calling tool available and email tool available in Canada by Monday morning. So we really, at this point, encourage people, especially those who do live in the US and Canada, to join our team in advocating for his release, because his release means, as you can see, it keeps the work going, and he has been able to make advocates out of so many more Kashmiris, and that really is a sign of a great organizer. So yes, his work will go on, but as we all would like his work to go on with him at the helm. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you to all the panelists for taking the time to share their insights and expertise with us. We encourage everyone to follow Justice for All, Free Kashmir, and Save India on Twitter for updates and ways that you can help. Also, please use the contact form, Justice for All, calling tool to Congress to ask to pressure India to release Khurram, and stay safe and well, everyone. Thank you so much.